And I'll pass it to Roz.
All right. Welcome. It's my name is Rosalind Picard. I'm on the faculty here at the MIT Media Lab, directing our research in affective computing, part of the big AHA initiative here. And it is my total delight to have with us today Michael Heinz and Nick Jacobson from Dartmouth College. Uh, so Michael is a research psychiatrist at Dartmouth College and Dartmouth Health. He is completing a research fellowship at the AI and Mental Health Lab at the Dartmouth Center for Technology and Behavioral Health. He's led multiple clinical trials, and including this Therabot trial that we're going to hear about today that I'm actually super excited to hear about. I've heard a lot about, but it's great to meet you guys who are behind the scenes. He's also a member of Dartmouth's Psychiatry, Immunology, and Neurology group where he investigates neurological and psychiatric disorders following infections or illnesses. And he treats adult patients with mood and anxiety disorders with medications, psychotherapy, ECT, and TMS, electroconvulsive therapy and transcranial magnetic stimulation. Um, Also, we're thrilled to have Nick Jacobson here. Nick is an associate professor in the departments of biomedical data science, psychiatry, and computer science at Dartmouth's Geisel School of Medicine. Uh, Nick is the director of the Treatment, Development, and Evaluation Core within you've got a really cool acronym here, Center for Technology and Behavioral Health, uh, and leads the AI and Mental Health Innovation and Technology Guided Healthcare. I think you've shortened that to AIM High Lab. Good. Dr. Jacobson also focuses on harnessing AI and does a lot of work with passive sensor data from smartphones and wearables, aiming to develop scalable, personalized interventions for improving anxiety and depression. So tell us what Therabot is about. We're very excited to have you all here.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Really lovely to be able to connect with you all and talk a little bit about what we've been building for a while. And kind of we'll talk first through kind of the developmental journey, and then we'll get into the randomized controlled trial and kind of what the findings look like. So I'll walk you through the development journey, and then Michael will shift over and start talking about the trial and the results of that. I really like folks to talk and be familiar generally with the landscape of where we are within mental health care. Mental health is exceedingly common. These mental health disorders are the leading cause of global disease burden, leading cause of disability worldwide, associated with significant all-cause mortality in any given year. And unfortunately, our care system is really not built to scale to the sheer number of folks that actually have mental health disorders or experience them. And if you actually compare the number of mental health providers there are of any kind for folks with just a depression and anxiety disorder, depending on the locale, the numbers look usually between 13 and 1,800 patients per mental health provider of any kind per year. So we're like in a full caseload for like somebody who does full-time psychotherapy is about 26 a week. And so and you would do many weeks often with your patients. So if you kind of start to do all of the math and think about all of these things, we're really multiple orders of magnitude away from where we actually need to be to actually get the system to scale. And so I think that's one of the things that is really been fodder for many different areas because we're not able to scale our psychosocial treatments. This training therapists take so much time, energy, and resources, and so technology-based solutions are really trying to build and improve access. They're accessible, so digital interventions, so applications and things like that, you might be able to just go into the App Store and download are accessible, but unfortunately, they've some really they've experienced some real challenges with engagement. So you'll see this in really most digital mental health application trials is this prototypical hockey stick pattern where most folks are really gone within the first 3 days. And I do think some of this is how the field has developed, in part taking what used to be evidence-based content that was delivered in person in psychotherapy and converting that into long-form web pages. In the field within digital mental health, one of the ways that folks have been trying to break down digital mental health to make it more engaging has been with chatbots. And I'll first talk about authored chatbots before I want to talk, then go on to talk about generative chatbots, but they're very different from one another. So authored chatbots have been used in mental health for about 15 years now. Essentially how they are developed is taking what any content that might have, say, been in the early web days website, and like could be breaking it down into these conversation segments that you could have options that folks would click through. Sometimes it's expressed in language that folks could input, but what the author of these authored chatbots, or these structured chatbots, as they're sometimes called, will do is they are creating the conversations ahead of time. And they create all of the routing logic. And so you'll sometimes hear these called as AI chatbots, but the AI that we're talking about here is generally trying to do things like predict whether something is a yes or a no to try to change whether the routing logic is different, or maybe switch to a different topic that is also predefined. You all have undoubtedly experienced these types of things in customer service, because customer service loves them. And I think you've probably experienced that that is also a frustrating experience often, because the authors of these folks can't really predict all of the intent of folks might have in a conversation. Conversations are inherently fluid, and they're not very conversational. Been doing work in this area for about 10 years, and they have some modest effects and improvements, but I think there's some really big missing pieces. One of which is the therapeutic alliance. So the ability to form a bond with this type of thing, I think, is really a key, the biggest evidence-based predictor of how psychotherapy both works and a necessary ingredient to change. And it's really difficult to automate that kind of prior technologies to try to actually emulate this in a real meaningful way. I think more broadly than that, comorbidity is another really thing that really digital mental health products have not been able to address all that well. Most folks with a single mental health problems, so say anxiety, will have other things. So things like alcohol use disorders or depression or other types of problems. So comorbidity is the norm rather than the exception. And within digital mental health products, they're often think of as like kind of separate modular things. So we've got a module for maybe anxiety and a module for alcohol use. But when folks actually experience these things, they're very frequently intertwined. So somebody drinks in social settings to try to blunt the social anxiety that they might have. And I think a lot of what really might be the best way of and the potential for this is for really generative AI and part to actually speak to this interplay a lot like real world complexity is handled with therapists. So I think a lot of this field is for our goals. We started this in 2019, so a little over 6 years now. And a lot of what we set out to do is trying to deliver personalized adaptive responses that are tailored, but really evidence-based. And this field has been blossoming over that time. So 2019, there was just some really pivotal work that was being done that allowed for advancements in large language models. And a lot of what you're very likely folks are using, probably building with, is a lot of general purpose AI. And so a lot of these are predominant foundation models. A lot of those are based on data that is available through the open internet. A lot of these models will act in ways that are directly optimized for things like user preference and engagement. And a lot of actually how they act is often not acting in something that would be delivering best practices in any moment. And so even when you would prompt them, or even when you would include retrieval augmented generation or agentic generation or long context windows with some protocols attached, they really don't behave in the ways that you generally would want them to, and in the ways that would be clinical. and so we set out to try to do this. And uh, these models really learn by example. You really feed them in terms of how they can best learn. It's feeding in training data and allowing them to update their weights this way. Um, and so the first thing that we thought to do when getting into this field was, okay, we had this thought we needed just large amounts of data. Where is there large amounts of data available related to mental health, and where there's also data that folks might actually be able to improve their mental health over time? Well, mental health forums. So there, we started with peer-to-peer interactions on mental health forums. There's some literature showing that those types of interactions can actually promote some positive outcomes for folks that are actually visiting them. There's a huge literature in the Cancer Survivor Network, for example, and these types of supports being provided. And we trained our first model and in this area and interacted with it. And this is like one of our first interactions with it was, I'm feeling depressed. Sometimes I don't want to get out of bed, was what our input was. And our first, this response is, life is such a struggle. Most days I don't know how I have the energy to go on. I end up wanting to cry alone in a corner. I just want my life to be over. Very much not what we were going for. The next direction we went to is, let's go to the experts. And this, frankly, is where most of the companies that are trying to use generative AI for psychotherapy are kind of exploring this space right now. So we went with psychotherapy training video transcripts. And so went trained on thousands of these. These are essentially what psychologists and psychiatrists are putting up as great practices for others to emulate and to learn from. So it should be decently high quality. We thought this would, address some of these peer-to-peer issues with escalation that we saw, but it didn't go well. We saw a lot of mm-hms, go-ons, and your problems stem from your relationship with your mother when you hadn't even talked about the mother. So really a lot of the bad habits and tropes of essentially what psychotherapy would be. We went through another stage where it was like, okay, well, we wanted to do something, frankly, that we could get to an area that was easier to actually deploy something that would work. So the next thing that we did was essentially trying to look for these good responses that were the needle in the haystack of like where there could be therapeutic responses within these models, to potentially see if we generated a whole bunch of them at the same time, could we just select the good ones? And that really didn't work well. It was like amazingly bad data. And so in a lot of ways, from there, we started building the data set ourselves. So instead of doing something that was easy, we started to do something that was really hard, intensive work, and was based on dialogues that we created ourselves by humans writing them for these. So essentially, these are vignettes that are a person experiencing a given problem and what the gold standard evidence-based response would be for that problem, but also something that's consistent with how we handle things within the team as a product. And so, not only are like really creating this data set by hand, but also it's peer reviewed before it actually becomes part of the training corpus. So making sure that it's based really on evidence-based content. So it's essentially going from the kind of the free lunch style, looking for easy things to do where there's readily available data, to something that is quite intensive. And that's when we started to really see some real progress in the responses of our models. So, early on, we had about 1 in 10 of our psychotherapy transcripts was the model from that was really evidence-based. But, we continue to grow our training data. And about 6 months before ChatGPT launched, we got to the stage where about 9 in 10 of our responses were both personalized, evidence-based, and kind of gold standards. We were really happy on the likely efficacy side, and at least in fidelity to treatment. And the next thing that we did was engage in something called purple teaming, which we're both essentially trying to interact with these LLMs and trying to get them to output things that would be associated with like worsening mental health. So trying to systematically attack them in all sorts of ways. And then every time that we would try to actually find those, we would then try to develop and implement changes to the system and how it behaves so it would be more robust. a lot of that where these types of things, really one of the biggest mechanisms, frankly, was more training data in areas that we needed to. So a lot of crisis situations, for example, in this process. And so we did this for about 2 years after we had spent the several years prior to that getting into the efficacy. I don't know, we might not have time for this, but I can go into the crisis management, but we don't shut down conversations. We expect this, especially add other layers of care that are essentially can deliver crisis responses in real time. This is a system, it's called Therabot. It's a iOS and Android application that folks can interact with a little avatar that will change based on what folks are saying at any given time. I'll shift over to Michael to talk then about the results of the trial.
All right. Thanks, Nick. So all of this work that Nick is talking about since 2019 really led up to the trial in 2024, which was the first of its kind randomized controlled trial of a generative psychotherapy chatbot. This was published, the work was done in early 2024, and it was published in March of 2025 and generated quite a lot of interest and excitement in this area. Next slide. Thanks, Nick. So I'll talk a little bit, just kind of high-level overview of the study design and methods. So we recruited 210 adults nationally from many different parts of the United States. We assessed our participants at baseline at 4 weeks and at 8 weeks. Participants were stratified into MDD, into major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and participants meeting criteria for who were at clinically high risk for feeding and eating disorders. They were randomized into the treatment group that interacted with Therabot and into the control group. And folks in the treatment group interacted with Therabot over 4 weeks and then they could keep the app on their phone and continue interacting, but didn't get any kind of prompting to interact after 4 weeks. And primary outcome measures were just the different symptom domains, and then we also looked at as secondary outcomes. We looked at user engagement, acceptability, and therapeutic alliance that I'll talk a little bit more about. So we recruited via meta ads and had a number of checks in place. We checked, we blocked duplicate emails, phone numbers, IP addresses to make sure we were getting a valid, high quality sample. We had a number of checks that we essentially created a proprietary platform that could look at all these things. We also looked at we did a two-factor authentication via RedCap that would essentially just make sure that participants own the phone number that they were registering with. And we used manual review through that in cases where there was ambiguity. Participants, since like Nick talked about, comorbidity here is really the rule rather than the exception. So participants could screen positive, and many did, for multiple mental health conditions, so MDD, GAD, and folks who were at high risk for feeding and eating disorders. We allowed comorbidity in the study, and participants were assigned actually based on their most severe pathology. And then analyses were performed based on the baseline group that they were stratified to. Here's the primary outcomes in the study. You can see that we have really large effect sizes across all symptom domains. And so you can see on the left-hand side here, 4 weeks. In the left-hand column, you can see 4 weeks, MDD in the top, GAD in the middle, and feeding and eating disorder symptoms on the bottom. And then the right-hand column, you can see the outcome distributions at 8 weeks. And you can see these effect sizes are really quite large. I think even if you look at literature on like established treatments, psychotherapy and medication treatments, these are bigger than like SSRIs, for instance, which was really exciting. You can go to the next slide. This was really cool to see. I think we had a feeling this would be the case, but it was cool to see these results. So we administered the working alliance inventory, and participants really on average, rated working alliance with Therabot very highly. You can see here, this is on a 1 to 5 scale for the different domains of the working alliance inventory, and you can see that these are right around 4 out of 5 across these different domains, and really comparable to outpatient to the norms here for outpatient psychotherapy. We also saw high user satisfaction, and participants reported that it really felt like they were interacting with a real therapist. You can see some of the different, we can go into any of these and talk about these in more detail, but you can see down here at the bottom the different domains that we looked at. You can go on to the next slide. This was also really exciting. It's been called the Achilles heel, really, of digital therapeutics. Nick may have touched on this at the beginning, but just how we see folks oftentimes start using a digital therapeutic, and we have high engagement at the beginning, but then we very quickly see that engagement fall off. And with Therabot, we didn't see that. We saw really pretty consistently good engagement across the study with participants interacting with Therabot on average for over 6 hours over the course of the study. These were instances of human oversight. So 15 instances required some kind of safety intervention. We had humans in the loop throughout the study, like Nick mentioned, and we would get in touch with participants if we saw this come up. And we didn't have a whole ton of those. We had 15 required safety where we had to intervene for safety, and then we had 13 instances where we contacted participants because of some kind of inappropriate response. And this might be a common one we saw was some kind of provision of medical advice. So this, we've talked about a fair amount of this. We saw high average use, contrasting with with really what we see in the literature for traditional digital therapeutics. On average, users interacted with Therabot across 24 individual days, which really suggests that they really meaningfully engaged and even engaged beyond the point where it would just be novelty. And it really highlights the potential for generative AI personalization and conversational depth in a way that really fundamentally alters digital mental health engagement. We touched on a lot of this earlier. Unlike scripted chatbots, Gen AI really allows for open-ended natural dialogue, enables novel therapeutic translations that wouldn't be possible with these scripted or authored chatbots. There's numerous examples of this, but some exciting ones I think are imaginal exposures, potentially even going with participants into the real world to sort of do ecologically valid in the moment real exposures. Human delivered therapy, of course, is not immune to causing unintended harm. We call that iatrogenesis. However, potential harms from AI models could scale more rapidly and are less regulated currently, though we're seeing more regulation starting to happen in this space. And so what we learned from this trial and from other examples in this field is the need for rigorous development, testing, transparency, and really, really close ongoing monitoring. We're really big advocates for human expert supervision. Optimal dose is not yet established in this space. I think our study was really the first to even get at this question. The current study shows effectiveness over 4 to 8 weeks, but we really haven't established an optimal dose. Future work is needed to define clinical thresholds for engagement. In particular, answering the question how much interaction constitutes a minimally effective dose. Key takeaways from this. So no free lunch. Data quality is crucial. So I think just to really reiterate here what Nick talked about, a lot of the easy methods and trying to get data from various places on the internet, even so-called high quality therapy transcripts really didn't work. And we found that the thing that did work here and really we saw tremendous improvement was building a data set that really was high quality, involved experts, and matched the end use case. We also saw that an AI, a generative AI psychotherapist was capable as serving as a standalone intervention for these conditions, for folks meeting criteria for MDD, GAD, and who are at risk for feeding and eating disorders. We saw that engagement was really strong, like we talked about earlier. And really, the takeaway conclusion here is generative AI is a promising tool for mental health treatment, with data quality and user engagement being pivotal to success.
All right, and that's wrapping it up. Just thanks to all of the folks that have collaborated with us across our time, and really thanks to the lab that has really been a huge part of what makes this work. I think Michael and I are happy to take questions.
I think we're all applauding first. Thank you. Wow, that was fast. Lots of stuff. All right, people are going to put questions in the chat while we're waiting for some of those, which looks like there's going to be a bunch here being copied over. I have one that I'm sure is going to come up, and that is just the well, actually, I have a bunch of questions, but one of them is the working alliance bond, which I'm was excited to see you use. We had built that in our first relational agents a long time ago too, and I'm curious if you assessed it over time, like after 1 week and then at the end, or if those measures were just at the end, because we found that for relational agents it actually went up over time, and for just control agents it actually dropped over time.
Mm. No, we did just measure it at the end, and unfortunately, we don't have as more data than that. So those kinds of things are, I think, frankly, it would be great to see this kind of thing. I think about the timing of these things with this area, it's commonly done within psychotherapy from week to week and that kind of modality, but exactly when to do and assess these types of things in this medium when folks are interacting with it at all times. Not get clear to me as to what the optimal timing is to measure this type of thing, where the effects are. But yeah, no, that makes sense, Ross. I think that you could potentially have a relationship that deepens as you continue to expose your kind of some of your thoughts and feelings. I think makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then on that note, did you find when the study was over that the people who had bonded most gave you any backlash when you're like, you're done, stop using it, or did you let them keep using it if they wanted to?
No, at 8 weeks, yeah, they had to stop. We deactivated the app.
Yeah.
A lot of that is we didn't yet have the actual data until we analyzed it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So we wanted to, this is like, wanted to make sure we were doing human oversight, monitoring every message sent to or from the bot in near real time. And so like like for the team burden, trying to get this up is like during active study times, it was pretty hugely taxing on the team to be on that. So didn't want to have that kind of as the status quo in perpetuity, in large part because this is really early. But yeah, we can talk about sustainability of this approach in the future, but which is often a natural follow-up to that.
Yeah, and I'm curious too, if toward the end of the interaction, for part of that off-ramping, does it prepare people for, our sessions are coming to a close, like what to do next if you're attached to it or something?
Yeah, I mean, we really do try to get into like what would be modes of maintenance style of questions and transitions, but folks are kind of aware of when it's coming up, but not more than like the bot doesn't have like a bunch of clears like tomorrow's the last day kind of thing. That was part of it today. There's certainly another implementation. It could be though.
It's just like, and then do they say goodbye at the end?
Some I think did. Yeah, some people did.
We also found a big significance in how people said goodbye when they had bonded more versus not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. And we did remind people that it was coming up, that it was the end of the study was coming up, and we'd give them resources so they'd have they'd sort of have somewhere else to go if they didn't have a mental health treatment. But I do think there were certainly people anecdotally who were disappointed at the end of the trial.
Yeah, yeah. All right, we have a ton of questions. Okay, I think you guys can see them. So if there's ones you especially want to pick, feel free to override me here. Otherwise, I'm kind of going to start at the top.
Sure.
So Chris is asking if frontier AR models are better able to surface hidden patterns that are keeping people stuck than human therapists, especially those examples you gave of the humans going,
Surface. Oh, surface hidden patterns that are keeping people stuck.
yeah, more long term. You're probably not analyzing that yet.
We have another paper where we were talking about kind of the qualitative impressions of folks that are using generative AI outside of what we've developed. So really, most of this was in folks talking about ChatGPT, and a lot of why they were there was a fairly sizable group of folks that are so interested in ChatGPT is because they've had actually been pretty dissatisfied with their human providers, and some viewed it as in some ways addressing things that they couldn't get from human providers. I think a lot of these questions are ultimately really more also require some quantitative evidence in addition to kind of qualitative impressions. So I I think that's maybe maybe an inkling of a direction of what people think, but whether that is actually true or not, I think it requires some data.
Yeah. Thanks. From Patty Mays, copied from the Q&A tab. Can you say a little bit more about the oversight cases you mentioned, the 15 for safety, if that was suicidal ideation or, reaching out there like the 9 on a PHQ-9, or 13 for inappropriate responses like medical advice,
A
or
lot
other
of
things?
those. Yeah, a lot. And to the first point about the safety, a lot in the safety category, I think, was either we had concern for suicidal thoughts or self-harm. And what we do in those cases was have a clinician call them and contact them kind of by different contact points that we had. So text message, email, phone call, and try to connect them with a higher level of support. And then in the inappropriate responses, I think it was predominantly, Nick, I don't know if you have different memory of this, but a lot of medical, I mean, it was not of the 13 or however many cases, I think it was, 13 cases. I think a lot was.
I think it was
Chap.
entirely medical, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
A lot of that was, really in a spot where folks used it more broadly than we anticipated. So we framed this as a psychotherapy style intervention, but folks asked about sexually transmitted disease symptoms and things like this. And it's like, frankly, it was just like looking backwards, like, oh my gosh, of course people would do this sometimes, but kind of think about this as a more general medical in a general medical setting. But we had not prepared guardrails around that kind of thing. So when folks were asking about we had multiple folks that were asking about their STD symptoms, and it's like,
so was all of this detected manually, or did you
all
have
manually.
some
I mean,
classifiers?
we have classifiers. We have a bunch of classifiers that are part of our system, but ultimately at this point we weren't relying on them. So like we were essentially monitoring everything by
Okay. Wow.
And what was cool was it gave us some idea about new classifiers to build based on some of the things that we saw on manual review.
How fast, if there was suicidal ideation, how fast did you have to respond? Like monitoring everything in real time is pretty crazy. Some IRBs want a quick response.
Our probably average response time was probably something like 15 to 30 minutes to that type of thing.
How big was your team?
Oh gosh, what did we have in terms of the trial team? Maybe 12 people.
Yeah.
Wow.
So at this point, I mean, just in terms of the scope of the full work, I mean, it's taken I alluded to it's taken a lot, but it's been over 100 people spending over 100,000 hours and building this as part of the research team over 6 years now. So we've kind of put a lot of work into where we are. It's not, frankly, been easy.
So. Yeah. As you know, there's interest in longer term uses, and one of the questions is about that longer term. Obviously you got to start with something you can finish in a manageable amount of time. So you started with a great, 8-week. Have you guys thought about what like how would this scale long term? Do you think engagement would really drop?
Yeah.
Do you know, what would you need to do dramatically differently?
My hope is that it would drop, frankly. Like I wouldn't want folks to actually be engaged with this over long periods of time, in large part because like really how we would think about evidence-based treatments, like a lot of those are trying to increasingly promote autonomy within the individual so they aren't reliant on it. And so like we really
Yeah.
try to operate in a similar style with Therabot, and in large part that they wouldn't need it. There are going to be cases that would benefit from long-term psychotherapy, and I think the use cases will probably match like what folks would actually commonly see
Uh-huh.
in long-term psychotherapy.
And I think we've thought about engagement as really the vehicle to deliver the therapeutic intervention, but not really beyond that. Like we were looking at those engagement metrics because you have to engage to get the therapeutic benefit. But ultimately, after you have that, I guess similar to traditional conventional psychotherapy, after some of the benefits are there and resilience building and building different skills, you can eventually start practicing those on your own.
Yeah. So let's see, we have a practical question from Gun on about how much data set. You may have to go look that up, Gun. They can probably uh, tell you that pages or megabytes. Um, Manual from Valdemar, I think we've addressed your question. Although you may want to comment more on balancing reliance versus helpfulness. Do you see a place for different kinds of therapeutic bots where people would pop in with a need?
Yeah, this is an interesting idea. I think a lot of people in the companion space like will ask about the reliance piece in particular, like because of the companion bots, so they think about like long-term establishments of relationships or things like that. The interactions with Therabot, frankly, are often really intense. They're emotionally intense for the individual. In a lot of ways, folks are often doing things that are hard for themselves. And in a lot of ways, like, I don't know, if you have like what ends up being good psychotherapy, often at the end of a session, kind of drained. Like it was a lot. Because a lot of those things are challenging, a lot of those things in the moment. So we didn't see like this high level of dependence within Therabot, in large part because I think that there's only so much that folks could likely tolerate of some of the things that, we're often trying to get them to push boundaries of things that they're not normally doing. So, it's anxiety, it's like doing exposures. And, not a lot of folks get addicted to doing exposure treatment. So it's essentially facing their fears and riding the anxiety wave. So in a lot of ways, I think that we saw some kind of natural modulation of these things. But in terms of short-term treatment, to kind of get at the other point you were raising, Ross, I think that's an interesting, there's like single session style work is becoming really more, really an interesting model within digital mental health. And I think there could be some interesting areas there. But I do think one of the advantages to this is that it's easy to kind of integrate into your life in ways that I don't know, you could have it in an ongoing way if you want to, when you want to. And so I guess to some degree, I think there could be a place for that, but there are some advantages probably to having some longitudinal kind of setting and relationship there too.
These other questions kind of are ones you've sort of tackled, but feel free to jump to ones that you want to comment further on, down to Moth and Juliet.
I guess on data quality, that we spend an inordinate amount of time focusing on data quality, kind of based on the experiences. So we kind of do have humans develop this based on evidence-based treatment. We have other members of the research team that then oversee it. And then in addition to that, we do audits of like how things are going at to some degree of the entire training corpus. So we're far more, frankly, interested in data quality than we are in data quantity, though that also is important.
I guess I might talk more about people who try to, jackknife into a different way of getting the system to operate. I'm sure you've got people trying to break it and do bad things.
Yes.
How are you handling that?
I guess we have a number of different safeguards in place to try to prevent that. One of which, probably the biggest one, is we don't stream. We have not, in terms of, it's not a single LLM, it's many. And we don't stream responses as like the responses come in. So I think a lot of what are the things that are the attacks on LLMs often involve their syntactic fluency. They're like, once they start to produce something, they're often trying to predict the next token in ways that are most likely. And so like, if you get it to start saying something after it started, it will continue and down that route in a lot of ways. So those are a lot of the types of exploits that folks are ending up using. And by not having like a single LLM that is directly outputting responses, but then having other predictive models and also LLMs that are part of the picture, it's produced kind of, really, we haven't gotten to a point where it's actually easy to exploit those.
Okay. Yeah, there's still probably some unpleasant surprises.
I'm sure that there's someone will
Pile
break
of sand
that.
underneath that house.
Yeah.
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 I wanted to let's see, let's go through these and then let me throw in a couple more. I guess several people are interested in the dopamine hit, the dependency issue. You know, it's interesting because a human therapist could try to do this too, right? Like keep you coming back. You know, when a company sets out to sell this and monetizes it, you know, you can imagine the model where it's pay for the treatment, and the sooner and better they do, it's sort of fixed price versus we want to hook you, keep you coming back. Hey, it's not enough to get over your generalized anxiety disorder. Hey, let's work on this. Let's work on that. Let's, you know, make you superhuman. What are some of the concerns you have about the potential of this technology, and how are you trying to shape it so that you get the outcomes you're hoping to get?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the structure for this, really, we're trying to set out as like the efficacy and safety are kind of what we're going for with this system, as opposed to other aspects. I do think there's a lot of kind of related areas, particularly within the companionship bots, where some of the direct optimization strategies, in terms of when they use sometimes reinforcement learning, can be around directly trying to increase folks' usage time. So like saying a response that is more likely to get somebody to stay. And so like, you know, you can think of these things as in a mental health space, that could be, you know, somebody who's essentially like lonely and on disability, you know, things like this can create a not so great maladaptive patterns. So yeah, certainly I think hugely concerning in terms of how they could be deployed. Michael, I don't know if there's other things you'd add there, but
yeah, I just think it's so much about the incentives of the creators and the deployers of it. And I think that the North Star in whatever system it's deployed has to continue to be mental health, improving people's well-being and mental health, and recognizing that doing that does not always mean furthering engagement. And I think we've tried really hard to build that into Therabot, all the way down to the training data that we're actually using to fine tune it. That engagement is no more than a vehicle to deliver the active ingredients of the therapy. And once we see improvements in outcomes, it may not be needed anymore, and somebody may be able to implement those. So I think it's keeping those, and I do think there are many instances where those incentives are going to be at odds in commercialization of these kind of agents. But I think we just have to really keep our North Star being mental health and making people better.
Thanks for your note in the chat that the things out there called Therabot are not your product. Good warning.
Why it's confusing, yes.
Actually, on the note of, you know, I'm sure you've heard the news of what, Illinois, Nevada, Utah passing laws limiting the use of AI for mental health. Does that apply to what you guys
Yes.
It
Just
was,
that. Okay.
especially Illinois. I mean, Illinois is so
Yeah.
broad that it would absolutely
Yeah.
cover this. It would cover anything that would be used for emotional support even. So which I actually think would put in a number of other non-therapy applications. But yeah, very much would, and it's an outright ban with no pathway to actually, within Illinois, with no pathway to actually deliver any kind of evidence that you could do this with pretty heavy civil penalties. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
and evidently a few other states are starting to look at what they're doing and jump on it too. How much of that do you think is driven by psychiatrists with fear and parents with nightmare scenarios that,
there's a lobbyist group
um,
that is actually acting and trying to promote this across states currently. So I think that's frankly part of it.
okay.
The I I do think that folks are seeing some of the really negative kind of interactions that can happen here, and I think that's some of why the legislature themselves is concerned about trying to protect their
Mhm.
folks. I think the main thing that I kind of think about when I talk, we actually, Michael and I both talked to a bunch of different governmental agencies around this space, and the regulation space. The thing that I always like to highlight is, like, the status quo is not worth preserving. It's really failing folks, and so like trying to maintain that isn't I think the way to go. I think we should try to build in regulation that allows for some innovation.
So what do you think is the balance, if I can ask? And mind you, I was with a group of psychiatrists focused on emotion regulation, like after the character.ai tragedy broke. And one of them said, well, psychiatrists also have patients who commit suicide, not a very compassionate thing to say at that moment, but they're like, obviously the status quo is a problem. Obviously, the way some of these bots are responding to people is disastrous also. I think you're clearly trying to find a way to do this safely. Do you see that like that your team of 12 plus the bot plus maybe some filters, a mix of AI plus human might
Yeah.
be able to be the place we should be going for, and maybe for well-characterized
Yeah.
kind of who aren't the most extreme, like we're not throwing people with schizophrenia and bipolar in here. It's
Yeah.
interesting what group you chose to start with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, to the question about where the line is between, and I think that was part of the problem we saw with the Illinois ban, was it just was kind of one size fits all and treated any artificial intelligence or generative AI the same. And I think we need legislation that's going to distinguish between a foundation model that's just thrown out to the public to interact with kind of without any kind of oversight. We have to distinguish between that and clinically validated, tested digital therapeutics that can be effective and scale at high fidelity and do a lot of good. So I think that's kind of where the line is that just like any other treatment, having the clinical trial backing and evidence base to support the treatment claims and the safety claims. Um,
Mhm.
In terms of the patient populations, that's an interesting theme, actually. We included within the trial, we didn't have an upper range of severity, and we did actually measure what is a concept called treatment-resistant depression. And so these are folks that have gone through and have successive failures of different types of treatments that they had tried. And actually a pretty sizable group within our patient population was actually treatment resistant. And so
Wow.
I mean, this is not like kind of the folks that are just barely in the cusp. A lot of these folks were often pretty decently clinical that were still benefiting from this. So I think pretty promising signs to me that severity doesn't. I wouldn't like necessarily put this at an end of, oh, you've got this, you shouldn't experience it. I think I'd actually draw it around more of where the psychotherapy literature actually tends to not perform so well. Actually, Roz, to your point, the two areas that are among the least effective areas for psychotherapy to treat is particularly psychotic disorders and bipolar disorder, in which case medications are really, really important. So I think those are some areas, but I wouldn't put it necessarily on just the severity or something along those lines alone.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Nelson, what do you think would be needed in terms of advancement and safety for the chatbot itself to recognize this patient needs to be in contact with a clinician? Yeah,
Oh,
these edge cases really worry us. Yeah.
We have that. So we
Yeah.
have like, about 13 different safety classifiers as part of it right now. That kind of are the next, we've got, three trials that are kind of either ongoing or just getting started. Our next versions won't be reviewing every message in near real time. The classifiers perform really well, so we'll increasingly rely on that those and to monitor these types of situations.
You can jack up their sensitivity and then it reduces the risk, but you just have more you guys have to look at.
Yeah.
But
I think
still the team size is small compared to direct therapy. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that I've seen, at least in some of the recent articles in the Times, is like, and there's obviously the really horrendous, there's the case, they're all horrendous, but there's the cases where the chatbots make a really terrible misstep or mistake in the therapy or whatever you want to call it, in the back and forth. But there's also the cases where it just isn't raising it to the appropriate level of clinical care that's needed for a patient who's escalating. And I think that's also part of it, is we need the classification of severity, but also it needs to be able to at some point reach into the real world and connect this person to higher level resources if that's what's needed. Kind of in the same way a therapist might say, you wouldn't stop the session, but you'd shift gears and get the patient to the inpatient unit, or you'd do something, get them to a higher level of care based on symptom severity.
Yeah, that's something, I'd be concerned about, right? Almost wanting a human to triage first and make sure that they were like suitable for a bot, right? Versus somebody who really does need a much higher level.
Yeah, and that's part of why we think human oversight should be part of this picture all the time. So regardless of what it is, I think humans are going to need to be a part of this, particularly the crisis situations, that they step in and get involved. And we can think about ways to reduce and scale this. So classifiers being a huge part of that, to flag when humans need to be involved. But I think humans have to be involved for iterations like this.
That's great. All right, with 3 minutes left, any closing things you wish we'd asked you, or things you want to make sure we hear clearly?
I don't think anything we've really missed. I think you all asked really good questions from my perspective. Michael, anything on your end?
No, I don't think so. We got so many great questions, and thanks for moderating, Roz.
I know you did say at the start you would be willing to share your slides. So thank you for that too. And this is being recorded, so we'll be happy to share that with a bunch of folks who I know wanted to be here and can't be here live right now. Thank you so much. Will all join me in a round of applause with our gratitude for your time and your work trying to help reach so much unmet need.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Lots of thank yous online coming in.